Howdy everyone, it's Ethan Hardy here. This video is going to be an infomercial about rounding hammers, as it says in the title. I've received lots of questions, comments, and just general interest about rounding hammers, especially on the YouTube channel since I posted the 100 Hammers building series for Alec. Obviously they're not like the classic rounding hammer, they're square circles. I'll be talking about both in this video. And so let's kind of get started with the classic rounding hammer and where it came from and its place. So this is what the classic rounding hammer looks like. It's made out of round steel, it has cheeks and it has troughs. And this hammer was popularized by Brian Brazil starting kind of in the early 2000s, and he claims that it was an old style of hammer that he, I guess, kind of refined the forging for and popularized, and obviously along with his techniques, the Brazil techniques and other tools that kind of went along with it. So farriers were traditionally and typically used by farriers. Farriers are people that shoe horses, and they're used because the round face can get inside of a curve. If you're going to hit the inside of a concave, you can't use a square face, you need a round face. And so that's a very simple reason why farriers typically used rounding hammers, and they use them kind of in the smaller weights, under 2 pounds-ish. And so Brian popularized the rounding hammer in larger weights to blacksmiths as a general forging hammer. And so I'll talk a little bit about the anatomy of the rounding hammer and what the faces do, and why people call it the most versatile type of hammer, and why I use it generally. So this is the example hammer that I'll be using. This is a 4.5 pound classic rounding hammer with very short stubby proportions, thin cheeks, and just kind of short overall. It's a hammer that I really like. I don't do a heck ton of hand forging anymore because I seem to become pretty much a power hammer blacksmith. But I'll just try and kind of repeat most of the important information that you should know. So the anatomy of the hammer is, obviously we have the face, or the die as Brian would call it. We have then the troughs that go all the way around. These are the trough lines. These are the cheeks. The opening for the handle is called the hammer eye, and that's pretty much it. We could get into more specific things, but that's the base of it. So I'll zoom up here on the round and the flat face, or it's the other way, round and flat face, so that you can see exactly what's going on here. As far as the geometry of the round face is concerned, it's a little bit more complicated than just a dome, and that is that it's a squashed ball. So the radius on the very center of the round face is more than the radius on the edge. So as you tilt it towards the edge, the curve gets sharper, so to speak, and so that's what lessens your surface area contact. That's why you have the infinite amount of dies, as people call that. So that's the geometry of the round face, and that's really important. And so you can see on the close-up here how that tilts and how that works. But the round face is your general forging face. So this is where most of your hitting on hot steel is going to happen, with this face here, and right in the middle, parallel like that, whether it's half on, half off the anvil, whether you're cutting, whatever you're doing. And that's because when you have a small surface area contact, you move more steel. The fancy way of putting it is surface area contact is directly proportional to the amount of steel moved. So that means that if you have a smaller surface area hitting your steel, it's going to move it faster. If the best example of this is if I were to take a piece of clay, set it on the anvil, and squish it, if I squished it with my whole hand over it, it wouldn't move as easily as if I just took my finger and squished it right in there. That would, because there's less surface area. So we can isolate that by using the round face. Another reason that we would want to use the round face is because on a flat piece of steel, so this would be, say if you're cutting, or if you're half on, half off on the edge, if you use the flat face, you can have a tendency to hit too far off or on the material. You can see how that would be, whereas your round die focuses exactly where that blow is going to go, even if you have an angle to your hammer. Now, by tilting the round face, you can make that surface area contact even smaller, so you can do even faster drawing, as well as using it kind of as a very short cross peen, as a rounded fuller. If you can imagine having a hand fuller and that's curved on the end, and you can make that small. You can make you can draw out, say, a leaf to have many different perimeters to it, I guess. A good example of this is Brian Brazil's video called "Why the Rounding Hammer Simply," where he uses a 1/2-inch piece of copper, and he draws out a leaf that's very ornate, and he uses the different radiuses of the round die to accomplish that. So it's very handy in that way. The other thing, of course, that you would use the round face of the hammer for is to hit punches and tooling, especially if it's bigger, because, and this goes for sledgehammers, this goes for anything. Always use a rounded face, of course, because of that same thing that I showed you before. If you hit with a flat face, you're going to hit too far on or off if you're off at your angle, and that's going to cause the hammer to either twist in your hand, which hurts, or it's going to cause the punch to blow out. Whereas if you use a round die, it doesn't actually matter what angle you hit it at, you're always going to have that nice positive contact, and that's self-explanatory. As far as the flat face is concerned, it's a little bit more simple. It's flatter than a normal forging face on, say, a cross peen or something like that, because it's specifically used for planishing flat things. So if you're drawing a taper, making something, you're going to want to match that angle, hold your hammer handle loosely, and that's going to get you really nice, flat, straight lines that can make really clean work. So it's a little bit flatter, as I mentioned. You've got a little bit of a radius, of course, back to front, and a little bit more of a radius side to side. And that's because, of course, generally you're forging perpendicular. The hammer handle is perpendicular to the piece, so you have a little bit more give as to the angle that that's going to be at. Whether the hammer is square, like a square circle hammer, or round, they're generally ground with this square grind on it, so 4 sides and then the corners taken off, and that's so you can turn the hammer, you can tilt it with your fingers, and that's going to give you either, depending on the orientation of the hammer, a cross peen or a straight peen, so it can be used as that as well. So very versatile, very good. I like these short stubby hammers because they seem to swing really well in my hand, and they when you're tilting them, if you can imagine, if we're tilting a long hammer like this to do a taper or to chop in with the edge or something like that, the point of the handle that's coming down, I guess you'd maybe call that the center of gravity or center of inertia or whatever, is farther off from the end of your piece. So the farther difference there is from the contact point and that straight vertical line of the handle, that's going to cause the hammer to twist more. So short stubby hammers seem to handle that twisting better, and that's in general, whether it's a short stubby cross peen or anything. Shorter hammers are typically something that I like a lot more. Also because they have wider faces, and depending on what type of work you're doing, you probably maybe like a wider face. As far as weight for these hammers go, the most popular weight is 3.5 pounds. That's something that Brian popularized, and of course Alex Steele sells a lot of them because that's what he uses. And I use a 3.5 pound very often too. This particular one is 4.5 pound. I just wanted to give a quick deal about weight of the hammers and inertia and productivity and forging and such. And the main thing that I just wanted to say was, if you take a 2-pound hammer and you hold it at the end of the handle, or you take a 4-pound hammer and you hold it closer to the head of the hammer, then you have the same amount, because of the leverage of the 2 pounds being out here or 4 pounds being right here, you have the same amount of leverage exerted on your wrists. So that's why and of course with a heavier hammer, you will get more power because you have more inertia in the head. You're not able to swing a 2-pound hammer faster than you can a 4-pound. And so for the type of work that you see people like I'm doing if I'm hand forging, or the other chain gang members, or Brian himself, or his students in general. That's why they're generally, especially if they're doing big work, they're using big hammers and they're choking up on them, because it's very easy to swing them that way, but they have more inertia because they're heavier and you can get more work done. And just generally, of course, because the head speed is slower, there's less shock in your hand. It's just I would recommend trying that. I know that that's a big debate in the blacksmith community, but I wanted to say something about that as well. The shape of the handles on these hammers, typically, if you're from the Brazil clan, it's going to be this just kind of straight handle, real simple. I like that because I can move my hand around easily, and it's not going to change the way that it feels in my hand. Sometimes I get really anxious if I'm have to swing something real hard, or just picking it up to tap in a die on a power hammer or something. I can grip it at the end, or in the middle, or up top, or whatever. Also, I like the way that the straight handles look, actually. And I also like the way that the rounding hammers look in general. So that's pretty much the reason why I use the rounding hammers, is because they look really cool. Aside from that, I do want to mention the reasons for these seemingly decorative features on the rounding hammer do all have a purpose. And so I'll explain that. So basically what this all comes from is wanting to have the maximum contact of the wood in the eye. So you can imagine that if you punched a hole in a piece of steel that was an inch thick, you would have about an inch of the wood contacting in the eye. Whereas if you punched a hole in a piece of 2-inch steel, you'd have about 2 inches of contact. So if you're able to spread those cheeks further with a fuller, you will have more surface area contact in the eye, which means that the handle will not come loose as readily. This is very important on small tools. You'll notice the Brian Brazil hammer I punch, or Brian Brazil style fullers with those nice cheeks that are spread. That's so that you have more contact with the wood in the eye. It's very important on small tools, but this has been carried over to the larger tools in the hammers. And so in order to get these cheeks spread, I know that there's a bulge after you punch an eye, but once you get past that down to the plane of the material, as you can see here, if I were to have a straight line across, you can see that those cheeks go below the plane of the hammer. In order to do that, you need to section in on the sides. That's done with a fuller, and that's where the side trough lines come in. So you can imagine you pinch those down, you have another section of material that you can then draw down even more to spread those cheeks further. Now, of course, it would look very funky and not work quite right if you just smash those fullers in from the side. You'd have lots of surface area contact to deal with, and so you just go all the way around. And that's where the look of the hammer comes from. It actually comes from something that's functional. It's not necessarily just for looks. Of course, another side effect of this is that it distributes the weight of the hammer a little bit differently. And a lot of people like the way that these hammers feel when they swing. They say that they feel like they're lighter, or they feel like they're easier to swing. I will definitely attest to that, even though a lot of people will call BS on that. I have many people's testimonials saying that. It's just a thing. It probably doesn't mean too much, but they do swing differently, whether it's good or bad, or whether you like it or not, from any other type of cross peen. So there you go. As far as the faces on these hammers, there's a hierarchy of hardness that I will tell you, or that I guess kind of go by, and that is that the anvil is at the top, the hammer is in the middle, whatever you're hitting with the hammer, if it's a cold tool, or a tool like a punch or a top tool, and then of course your steel, your hot steel. So the reason that is, so that at the top the anvil should be the hardest, so the least likely to deform, and everything under that follows in that hierarchy. The reason that is because that follows the things that are typically either more meaningful, more expensive, harder to replace, etc. So if I was hitting my punch with a hammer, I would want the punch to deform, not the hammer. I want the punch to mushroom over, not the hammer to have marks in it, because the hammer would be more expensive and harder to replace, and the punch wouldn't. So I would want the punch to be thrown away or have to be fixed before I would want the hammer to be thrown away or have to be fixed. Your hammer should last a long time, of course. However, if I went to strike on my steel, I missed and I hit the anvil, I would rather have my hammer deformed than my anvil, because the anvil is hard to replace and expensive. So in that case, even though this is still valuable, I'd rather have it deformed than the anvil. So that's where the anvil is the hardest thing, or should be the hardest thing. The hammer should be the second hardest thing, and of course whatever you're hitting with the hammer should be softer than it. So therefore, if you miss, you will probably get a ding in your hammer, and you can deal with that simply by grinding it out with a grinding belt or even a bench grinder with a stone. There's other methods, of course. As long as you go to about 120 grit, the scratches will be fine enough that it will not show up in your steel. So that would be the way to do it. You can take it to a polishing wheel if you want, that's okay. Also, when you're bouncing, if you bounce the hammer off the anvil while you're working and there's scale on the anvil, especially if it's a harder type of steel, you are going to get little dimples in your hammer face from the scale, because scale is extremely hard, and scale in between the hammer face and the anvil will kind of dimple up the hammer face. It's something that seems to go away with time as the face work hardens, but that's just also something to note. If you're seeing very, very small little dimples in your hammer, that's typically what it's from. So with that, that's my little ramming hammer infomercial. I hope you understand a little bit more about what the deal is with taking care of your hammer and learning about it, so you can know who to look up, what the right terminology is, all that kind of stuff, and just answer some general questions. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you on the next video. Bye-bye.